Philosophy, particularly deconstruction, should not be considered a pioneering tool for feminist politics. It helps us see practices and ideas as neither natural nor inevitable, but it does not help us decide which social constructs to retain and which to replace. Most intellectuals hope to join the struggle of the weak against the strong by making their particular gifts and competencies relevant to that struggle. The term most frequently used in recent decades to formulate this hope is critique of ideology, which suggests that philosophers, literary critics, lawyers, historians, and others who are good at making distinctions, redescribing, and recontextualizing can put their talents to use by exposing or demystifying present social practices. The most efficient way to expose or demystify an existing practice would seem to be by suggesting an alternative practice, rather than criticizing the current one. In politics, anomalies within old paradigms can pile up indefinitely without providing much basis for criticism until a new option is offered. Imminent criticism of the old paradigm is relatively ineffective, and the most effective way to criticize current descriptions of the oppression of the weak as a necessary evil is to explain just why it is not in fact necessary, by explaining how a specific institutional change would eliminate it. This means sketching an alternative future and a scenario of political action that might take us from the present to the future. Marx and Engels make this point in the German ideology when they criticize Feuerbach for changing the word communist, which in the real world means the follower of a definite revolutionary party, into a mere category. Their confidence that their criticisms substituted reality for illusion and science for fantasy was greatly strengthened by the fact that they had a revolutionary party and a program. Contemporary feminist politics is more analogous to 18th century abolitionism than to 19th century communism. Feminists are in the situation where they suspect that piecemeal reforms will leave an underlying and unnecessary evil largely untouched. They cannot easily sketch a revolutionary political scenario or a post-revolutionary utopia, leading to a lot of talk about philosophical revolutions and revolutions in consciousness. The concept of critique of ideology in feminist thought has been a subject of debate, with some scholars questioning whether it can be maintained without mentioning the distinction between matter and consciousness. Terry Eagleton's ideology offers a definition of ideas and beliefs which help to legitimate the interests of a ruling group or class, specifically by distortion and dissimulation. However, this contrast is difficult for feminists to apply, as it is largely irrelevant to the oppression of women by men. If we drop the matter-consciousness distinction and fall back on the first of the two definitions of ideology, we come into conflict with the philosophical views about truth, knowledge, and objectivity held by most contemporary feminist intellectuals, who hope to put their gifts and competencies to work, criticizing masculinist ideology. Disdiscipline presupposes a medium of representation that produces an appearance that does not correspond to the reality of the object under investigation. This representationalism cannot be squared either with the pragmatist insistence that truth is not a matter of correspondence to the intrinsic nature of reality, or with the deconstructionist rejection of what Derrida calls the metaphysics of presence. Pragmatists and deconstructionists agree that everything is a social construct, and there is no point in trying to distinguish between the natural and the merely cultural. They agree that the question is which social constructs to discard and which to keep, and that there is no point in appealing to the way things really are in the course of struggles over who gets to construct what. Both philosophical schools can agree that if there are no values and beliefs not bound up with power, then the term ideology threatens to expand to the vanishing point. The distinction that runs through the German ideology between Marxist science and mere philosophical fantasy is an excellent example of a claim to have reached what Derrida calls a full presence which is beyond the reach of play. Feminist intellectuals who wish to criticize masculinist ideology and use deconstruction to do so must one think of something new for ideology to mean. 2. Disassociate deconstruction from anti-representationalism, from the denial that we can answer the question, have I constructed the object validly? Or 3. Say that the question of whether their criticisms of masculinist social practices are scientific or philosophically well-grounded, like the question of whether masculism distorted things, is beside the point. The best option is the last one, as the first option is simply not worth the trouble, and the second cannot be done at all. Feminists want to change the social world, so they cannot have too much respect for past descriptions of social institutions. The most interesting question about the utility of deconstruction for feminism is whether, once Nietzsche, Dewey, Derrida, et al. Have convinced us that there is nothing natural, scientific, or objective about any given masculinist practice or description, and that all objects, neutrinos, chairs, women, men, litter, theory, feminism, are social constructs. Deconstruction is often argued to offer tools that enable feminists to show that differences between entities, such as prose and poetry, man and woman, literature and theory, guilt and innocence, are based on a repression of differences within entities. However, the question of whether these differences were there, or only after the feminist has finished reshaping the entity into a social construct, nearer her heart's desire, seems of little interest. The author argues that philosophy is not a source of tools for path-breaking political work, as it is not a source of tools for political work. It is more about persuading people to act differently than in the past, rather than what ultimately determines whether they will or will not change their ways. Philosophy can free up our imagination and help us visualize new practices, but it is not a source of tools for path-breaking political work. Masculism is a much bigger and fiercer monster than any of the little, parochial monsters with which pragmatists and deconstructionists struggle. Masculism is the defense of the people who have been on top since the beginning of history, against attempts to topple them, and it is very adaptable. It can survive almost as well in an anti-logocentric as in a logocentric philosophical environment. The main advantage of pragmatists presenting these doctrines is that they make clear that they are not unlocking deep secrets, secrets that feminists must know in order to succeed. They admit that all they have to offer is occasional bits of ad hoc advice, which is advice about how to reply when masculinists attempts to make present practices seem inevitable. Neither pragmatists nor deconstructionists can do more for feminism than help rebut attempts to ground these practices on something deeper than a contingent historical fact, the fact that the people with the slightly larger muscles have been bullying the people with the slightly smaller muscles for a very long time is the sort of metaphysical topic feminists can safely neglect. In conclusion, anything that philosophy can do to free up our imagination is all to the political good, as the freer the imagination of the present is, the more likely it is that future social practices will be different from past practices. However, the image of philosophy as a pioneer is part of a logocentric conception of intellectual work with which feminists should have no truck.